Hi, I'm Jay, and today we're exploring native bushcraft survival shelters that are thousands of years old. We're finding ancient stone artifacts, and we're trying not to get attacked by porcupines. Come on with me, it's gonna be an awesome adventure. It's been a number of years since I've been out this way. I discovered these sites that I'm taking you to today probably close to 20 years ago, and it's a huge grouping of rock shelters intermingled with prehistoric flint quarries, and I've never really counted how many rock shelters there are here, so that's what I want to do today. I want to get a count of how many rock shelter sites there are. And during the winter time, it's the best time to do it. One thing is you can see really well with the leaves off the trees, with the snow on the ground. So you can rapidly cover quite a bit of ground. And the outcroppings of rocks just really stand out quite easy for you. It just feels good to be outside. Been sick in bed for the past week. My wife and I caught the flu from one of our children. Any of you with young kids, I'm sure you can relate. We got coyote footprints here. Here's a squirrel. Here's deer. I'll add my tracks to the bunch. This shelter here doesn't look like much of a shelter, doesn't have much of an overhang, but the native cultures around here, they didn't need much. Some of the archaeological rock shelters that had been excavated around here in the 1940s and 50s didn't have an overhang at all. They were just a sheer rock cliff face that just went straight up and down. And as long as they were in the lee of the wind, the native cultures, what they would do is they would just angle up branches in front of it, drape hides and animal skins over the branches that they leaned up against the side of the cliff face, the rock face, and they had a perfectly good shelter. They didn't need much of an overhang at all. This one actually does have a little bit of an overhang. You can see there's an area beneath it that has been sheltered and protected from the snow here. That's another reason why I like mapping rock shelters and caves during the wintertime, is that you can kind of see how much of a sheltered area they have based on how much exposed ground is beneath them. That all depends on which way the wind's coming from and everything, of course. They also didn't need much of a living surface out in front of these here. This is plenty enough shelter for one person, and they didn't need to stand up in them. A lot of people, they think of rock shelters as an archaeological site. These cultures, you know, would have to be able to stand up in them, and the ceilings would have to be pretty tall. But that's just not the case. A lot of these shelters, they just use to get out of the wind and the rain, the snow, the elements and such. And as long as they hunkered right down, you know, built a fire out in front of it, they served just well for them as a shelter, and they certainly did not need to be tall enough to stand up in. But you might say, well, this is a really small shelter, Jay. You think that native cultures use something this small? Well, I'm going to show you some shelters in a little while here that are maybe even smaller than this, and we'll find some artifacts that are on the bottom of them. Matter of fact, like 20 years ago when I first discovered them, I found a bunch of artifacts right laying on the surface, and they should still be there, so we'll check that out. Most of the rock shelters here on this property are on two ridges. However, there's a grouping of them back on the far end of the property, a little cluster of them that are just by themselves. They're real nice shelters, but I just did a big loop over there. I wasn't able to find him. And like I said, when I first found him was like 20 years ago. And I haven't been to him since. But I circled back to the other side of the property where the two ridges are. And we're about to hit the one ridge that's full of shelters, and I can see it. I can see where the cliffs start right behind me there. Oh yeah, really nice rock shelter. See that right there? When looking at a rock shelter from the side, you can really get a good idea of how much of a sheltered area there is. I like that furthest one better as an archaeological site. There's more of an overhang, more of a living surface out in front of it also. We'll check that out. You see, a lot of times you can find artifacts just sitting on the surface underneath these shelters, but it all depends on how much of the overhanging cliff face wall has eroded and weathered off and fell onto the ground and, you know, essentially covered any artifacts laying on the surface. This sandstone is pretty brittle. You can see it's just coming out, and it's just covered the ground here. That's not to say you can't still find artifacts on the surface. In these sandstone rock shelters, I find artifacts on the surface quite a bit, and we're going to go look at a couple in a little while here, where there still should be some artifacts laying on the surface. But this is a good shelter. I like this. It's got quite a bit of a roof overhang here, and I can stand up in it. As I mentioned before, these native cultures didn't have to be able to stand up in it. As long as they could hunker down and get out of the elements, it's fine. However, it just makes it more attractive to them if the shelter is tall enough that they could stand up in and move around. And as you can see, this one certainly is. I mean, I could reach way up there, and I'm sheltered quite nicely here. There's quite a bit of room in there. You could fit a small family in there easily, no problem. Oh yeah, this is looking real good here. Another thing you'll notice about these shelters is they all kind of stick out of the ground at about a 45-degree angle. That's kind of indicative for this type of sandstone rock shelter that we have in this area here. And they all, for the most part, they all face west. I don't know how good that is for being a shelter in this area, because our predominant wind direction is a westerly wind. So they're kind of facing the direction that the wind came from. That's not to say that these shelters weren't used when there was a north or a south wind direction. We very rarely get winds out of the east. I don't know if that was the same case during prehistory or not, but again, like I mentioned earlier, these shelters also most likely had had poles sticking in front of them with animal hides and skins draped over in front of them to really just complete the shelter. Oh wow. Yeah, this is beautiful right here. This is a really nice looking shelter right here. Let's see down there. Big buck tracks. It's like I'm using the same trail he is. You see all the coyote footprints up here. A lot of times these rock shelters are used as dens by different predators, foxes, coyotes, bobcats, whatever you have in the area. As a matter of fact, I see a den right there, actually. Hopefully we don't get a little too close for comfort for whatever animals in there. But I can see the hares, actually. There's hares right here. For whatever animal that is. You see that. Whoop, I'm sliding down. And there's a den right in there. I meant to bring my flashlight with me if I can climb up here. But I forgot. Oh boy. Oh, you know what it is? It's porcupine. But those hares wouldn't be porcupine hares. I think this is porcupine scat right here. I'm not mistaken. Oh yeah. Yeah, and there's his quills. Cool. So, back in there, he's in there, probably. All this is porcupine scat. And let me see if we can... Hopefully the porcupine doesn't come running out here and I get a face full of quills here. But this is definitely an archaeological site here. This is a great shelter. Let's see here. Porcupine quills, here we go. And just scat all over the place. All right. Here. They're just all over the place. Now, something else I want to show you about this shelter is it is partially collapsed. And there's some other rock shelters along this ridge that are collapsed archaeological sites. So you see here, this piece used to be up there, and over time it fell down. So the shelter, oop, sliding here. The shelter used to be bigger. It's actually kind of like a double shelter now, but two things I want to mention about that. One is you got to be careful when you're working on some of these archaeological sites, some of these rock shelters. They could collapse on you. And another thing is, some of these collapsed rock shelters completely just are falling on the ground and are covering the entire archaeological site, so you can't even work on them anymore unless you have some way of moving a massive boulder like that. Well, look at that. Boy, that's a nice little shelter right there. Who knows how long ago that had collapsed. Oh wow, yeah, big time shelters coming up. I remember those. Now, some of these shelters don't have much of a living surface out in front of it. This one definitely has enough that it could have been used, and probably was used during prehistoric times, but sometimes the hill slope comes right up to the face of the shelter itself, and there's just no way that it could have been used. You need a little bit of a flat shelf just coming out before the hill drops off, and this one has it. Oh yeah. Uh-huh. Oh yeah, this is a nice tall one too. It's a nice tall shelter. Oh yeah. Real tall. Look at this one. That's quite the shelter. This one even has a little seat right here that I'm going to take advantage of right now. This is a really nice shelter here. I am going to use this shelter for a minute. Whoa, sit down. I'm getting a bit hungry. I sit next to this porcupine den here, and at least I can sit down and not be in the snow, which is nice. Whew. Whew. This is nice. Getting a bit hungry here. Leave the camera rolling, so just in case the porcupine does come out, at least get some good footage of him attacking me. Got some smoked Gouda. Oh yeah, that's nice. That's good stuff. There's something about smoked cheese. I don't know. I have a passion for it. You know, this time of year, there's not much else you can do in this area with regards to field work. Ground's frozen, can't do much excavation, and with all the snow cover and everything, so now's the time of year where a lot of lab work is done. But pretty soon here, in a couple months, we'll be able to get out in the field and do some more research here. There's some big coyote footprints right here, real big ones, right there. It's a big coyote. I'm at that rock shelter I was telling you about, and the artifacts are still on the surface here from 20 years ago. The last time I touched these same artifacts. Probably 20 years ago. I was a much younger man back then, and this is a very small rock shelter here. But what you can see is that the interface of the shelter is not very brittle. So over the years, yes, of course, it has weathered to some extent, but not so much to where it's completely covered any of the cultural material on the ground. So let me show you here. This is flint, chips of flint, flakes of flint, and this is the byproduct from stone tool manufacture. Often these flakes themselves are very sharp and they're used as utilized flakes. But as I mentioned before, surrounding these rock shelters along these ridges are very high grade sources of flint that these native cultures needed to make their stone tools from. And this is really quite a nice area for them. They had ready-made shelters plus the natural raw materials of the flint to make tools from, and there's just artifacts all over the surface here. I'll show you some more in a minute, but I'd say the last time the shelter was used was probably 300 years ago, you know, during the early 1700s, and I'm sure it was used probably a bit earlier than that. Most of the shelters around here, the earliest they date to is about the late Archaic period, maybe about 4,500 years ago, and they're usually used continuously right up until about 300 years ago. That's not to say that there isn't much earlier cultural evidence in some of these shelters, and I'm sure that there is. That right there is some charcoal from perhaps the last campfire that native cultures who use this rock shelter had here. It's really cool. It's quite something when you find cultural material that's not stone. It's really rare for us to get any kind of organic material that's cultural, an artifact that survives for that lengthy period of time, you know, even 300 years, you know, that's it's something. Almost everything we find artifact wise is made from stone, and the reality, the fact of the reality is that stone comprised such a small portion of the material culture the lives of these individuals, you know. So anytime we can find any organic material, it's really cool. And one thing is, and this, I think this shelter actually you could see a lot of times when you get in these shelters. I don't know if you could see that right there, those black stains right there. A lot of times you could tell if a shelter had been used in prehistory or not based on the soot from the campfire themselves, on the inner face walls, overhanging walls of the shelter. And I think that's what that is right there. Here's some more flint right here. Some more charcoal also. Some larger pieces of flint. One thing that I find a lot of on the surface of these rock shelters is prehistoric pottery. I remember looking for it here when I first discovered this site. I don't recall finding any, but there's a rock shelter that I had been excavating on and off for a few years that I'm going to take you to just on the back ridge, and I had found some prehistoric pottery laying on the surface of that shelter when I first discovered it. Just looking at the ground here, just looking over the artifacts out on the ground, I found a stone drill. there's no doubt that's what it is. Used for perforating clothing and probably in all sorts of number of other uses. But it's pretty cool. Kind of a rare artifact. The end of it's broken off here. It probably was hafted. There's the end that broke off, the proximal end. There was probably a piece that to where it was wrapped on a little handle that they could use. We're gonna put that right back on the ground here. And there we go. One thing I want to show you is just how small this rock shelter is. You can't barely stand up in it. But there's no question that it was used by prehistoric cultures. I mean, the evidence is clear with the artifacts scattered all over the surface of the ground here. Turkeys have been in here. There's some prehistoric quarries, flint quarries, right around here. But I don't know if we're going to be able to see them because the snow's covered them up. But like 20 years ago when I first discovered this place, I found some really incredible sights here. Really incredible. So a little cheat code that I use for discovering indigenous flint quarries is you look at the stone walls, the rock walls that the early settlers put up, and see this big boulder right here? Pure flint. It's chert really, but high grade stuff. Even though it doesn't look like there's any fields around here, and this is just all woods, back 200 years ago or so, when these early settlers made this stone wall, this is all pasture land and all field, and they picked up the rocks and the stones and such from the field to have better ground to grow crops, and piled it up for their livestock to make fences for them. Essentially, they had all the rock and stone to do so, and that's how I know a lot of times when I'm getting close to flint sources, searching for new prehistoric quarries, is just looking at stone walls. And we're getting close to some prehistoric quarries. I should be able to show you some depressions in the ground from prehistoric quarry pits, actually. I don't think the snow will be covering them. And if I'm not mistaken, they're at the top of this ridge here. So it might be a little hard to see here, but there's a little bowl right here, a little bowl-shaped depression, and that is a small prehistoric quarry pit. Native cultures, probably thousands and thousands of years ago, dug down to access high-grade sources of flint. So the beds of flint come close to the surface of the ground here, and there must be a really nice vein of it right here, because they continued to dig down to access that one vein there. And I'll kick away the snow, see if we can see some. You could see it actually right here, coming out of the base of the tree here. So here is, you can see that there. That's a natural outcropping of flint. It's frozen to the ground here. These hunks and pieces here are the quarry debris from them mining out that little hole behind us here. all that's flint right there. This is the source that they would use to make their stone tools from in this area. And it's very possible that at that rock shelter that we just were at, that those stone tools that we found there, and those chips and flakes and the byproduct of making stone tools came from this outcropping right here. It's probably the case because it's the closest one to that rock shelter. Rock shelter's just right over the hill there. Oh, it's frozen on the ground here, but you could see. Oftentimes, in these prehistoric quarry pits, you'll find laying on the surface the instruments that these indigenous cultures used to mine out the flint, to quarry out the flint. And what they would use are big lithic extraction implements made from big quartzite boulders. And I'm sure that in the stone wall here, we could find some, and I've actually found a lot of them in stone walls in this region here. What they would do is they would take the big boulders of quartzite and they drive it over their head and try to pry out these beds of flint here. Really cool. Okay, so here we go. This rock wall is comprised of 3 different types of stones. One is there's flint in this rock wall. I already showed you some down the ways. The majority of the rock wall is made from the sandstone, the same type of sandstone that the rock shelters are made of. But here is a big quartzite boulder, and it looks. I think I just called my shot. I think this is a lithic extraction instrument here. Let me see if I can show you. There's a working bit on this end here, right here, where flakes of this have been driven off from right behind me, probably from where these indigenous cultures were using it to pry beds of flint out of the ground there. And all the quartzite around here came out of the glaciers as glacial erratics. Some were massive, others were small like this, and a lot of it is Potsdam sandstone and other quartzite from further up north in the Adirondacks north of here, and even a little bit further north. The glacier would pick it up. These rocks would be stuck in the glacier, and when the glacier melted and receded back northward from here, these dropped out of it. Might be a little hard to see, but there are some fresh flakes taken off of this, and I'm almost positive it is from the extraction of flint here. You could see grooves right there on the working bit. Some of these actually are really quite nice. I'll show them to you in another video. I have some in my lab, actually quite a few, because I do a lot of quarry research on prehistoric quarries, and there's some really nice looking ones. I'll stick this back in the stone wall here. But it really worked out quite nice for the indigenous cultures of this area that the glaciers dropped these erratics, these glacial erratic boulders right on the flint sources, so they could use them to pry out the flint. It really worked out quite advantageous for them. Might be kind of hard to see, but there's a swamp to my right here, and cliffs to my left. And at the base of the cliffs They come down and they make a little tiny flat path. And I'm almost positive this is an ancient Native American footpath. When I first discovered this path 20 some odd years ago, I found artifacts along this path, and it's the only way to get to those sources of flint and the main rock shelters, especially the real big one that I had done a bit of excavating on, that I'm going to show you in a little bit. And it's the only way to come through this one little area right here. And I'm almost positive that after the Native Americans left this area, the animals continued to keep it open. It's a real beat down path, and like I said, I found artifacts along it, and it's the only way to connect to these sources of flint and the rock shelter. Just really cool piece of history that you don't really see too much. We've got the swamp to the right. The cliff comes down and makes a little tiny flat little path here. Again, it probably doesn't look like much this time of year, although with the snow you might even be able to see it better. But there are some trees that had fallen down, but the path goes straight this way. It's a little flat spot there. You might actually, you can probably see it better this way. Where the hill comes down, little flat, and then that's all wet there. It's the only way that they could take to get through there. It's a little overgrown, but I'm nearly certain of it. I'm nearly sure of it, that that's what this was originally. And actually, along the footpath here, this little rock shelter right here, I found a tip of a projectile point, stone projectile point in this rock shelter. And I left it in there. I'm sure it's still in there somewhere. You could see that the animals are using it still. It's like coyote footprints. I could see my rock shelter. Oh baby, check this out. Check out that shelter. Wow. How's that for an overhang? You could fit a couple of families in this thing. So I had begun to excavate this rock shelter a number of years ago. Worked on it on and off for a couple of years. You can kind of see my units that I dug right there. Didn't finish it. I get bored easily, so I kind of hop around from sites to sites that I'm working on. You would not believe the amount of bones that I found in here that the indigenous cultures were eating, the animals that they were eating. A lot of beaver teeth too, and we see that a lot with the later cultures. Is that they would take the beaver teeth and they would perforate holes in them and wear them as jewelry and such. But a lot of prehistoric pottery in this rock shelter, tons of flint, but I didn't take it down too far. I took it down maybe I don't know, 20 inches or so, but I've got quite a bit of more work to do on the shelter, and I think I might start it back this year and take you along with me. The reason why I like this spot so much is not only the size of the shelter is immense, but just the location of where it is. So right behind me here, that ridge, that is all flint, that whole ridge right there. And in front of the shelter, that's a pond. That is a water source. And there's, you know, I get probably food in there as well. Turtles, maybe at one point there's fish in there, frogs, what have you. So you have all in one spot. You have shelter, you have natural resource of flint for them to make their tools from, and you have a water source all right here in one location. That's very, very rare to find. And one thing, if you're looking for prehistoric sites, the best ones are where you can have as many natural resources as possible all together in one location, and that's what you got with this shelter right here. Another thing that I like about this shelter is, if you know anything about me, I study the Ice Age. I study the cultures, the first cultures of people here in the Americas, and I think that this rock shelter has really good potential to have Ice Age cultural material, paleo material at the basal levels for a couple of reasons. One is at the south end of this ridge of flint, I found Ice Age archaeological sites. They're artifacts right on the surface where they were mining out the flint. And at the north end of the ridge, I found the same thing. And they would have to come right by this shelter to access any of that flint there on that ridge. This shelter would have literally been in their face. They couldn't have missed it. So it's really, I think, is a perfect place to find Ice Age cultural material. Rock shelters and caves are something that we really need to focus on with regards to the archaeological research of that time period, especially in northeastern North America, because we have very poor dates for the cultural occupation during the Ice Age. And the best place to get organic materials that you can radiocarbon date is in sheltered sites like this, like a cave or a rock shelter. Nearly all of the Ice Age sites that we have in this region are what's called open air sites that are exposed to the elements, that are not a cave or a rock shelter, and therefore organic materials that we can date just don't stand the test of time. They're withered away by the elements. But as you could see in that small shelter that we looked at, there's charcoal just laying on the surface there. Granted, that's probably only 300 years old. However, that would not be there even if it was an open air site. You're just not going to find charcoal that's 300 years old exposed to the elements. And with this site here, I hadn't taken it back down to the Ice Age levels yet, but the amount of organic materials from this shelter is just mind-boggling. I have quite a bit more work to do here, and I'm excited to take you along with me. You know, every one of these rock shelters I showed you today probably were used at the same times. You know, you have various different groups and different families all using these together, and they were probably all occupied as like a little village. Well, I wasn't able to get to every shelter today because I ran out of time and I have to go pick up our son from school. But if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. It's free, and I've got a lot of other content that I'm putting out soon that I think you'll like as well.